this is Carrie from Photography for the Rest of Us, a place for people who love photography. And today we are talking about aperture and understanding how aperture relates to shooting in manual mode. Now this is video 2 in a 10 video series. So if you didn't see video 1, if you could just go back and check that one out first. This is a progressive series and I really want you to be able to see all 10 videos, even though they're all pretty short. This one might be the longest one. If you did watch the first video, awesome. Good job following directions. Okay, so aperture is kind of a big one, and I don't want you to get too overwhelmed, so I want you to know that I'm not going to cover every single little detail. I will do an additional, advanced level 2 aperture video at some time in the future, but right now I just want to get you started understanding the basics of what aperture does. So let's break it down to start with. First off, if your camera is the brain, the lens is the eyeball, and the aperture would be the pupil of the eye. So there's little blades inside of the lens that open and close and make the opening bigger and smaller, like this. And just like your pupil, it helps control how much light is being let into the camera and exposing the sensor or the film, right? So if your pupil is very big, it's letting lots of light in, and if it's very small, it's letting less light in. And that's what makes the aperture part of the 3 parts of the exposure triangle that we're going to talk about in video 5. So I'm not going to cover it right now. Just take note, aperture, part of the exposure triangle. Okay, because your lens is what controls your aperture, we're going to take a moment and look at our lenses and really understand some of the numbers that are on here. I'm not going to go over all of them. I just want you to have a basic understanding. So the different companies write it a little bit differently, but you should see something kind of like this or like that written somewhere on your lens, either on the top part, on the front, Canon likes to put them here, on the top, or even sometimes on the bottom part of your lens. So pause the video for a second and I want you to see if you can find numbers similar to these somewhere on your lens, and then unpause me. I'll wait. It's cool. Not in a hurry. Go ahead and just find it. Okay, so as an example, this lens I have on here right now, it says 24 to 70 millimeters at f2.8. Okay. Now some of the other lenses might say something like, this one says 18 to 270 millimeter f3.5 to 6.3. Instead of f, it might also say 1 dot dot, all right, and then the numbers. And what I really want you to identify is whether it's a range of numbers or whether it's a single number. So some of these just say 2.8, and those are for kind of my higher level lenses. And then the range tends to be for the zoom lenses, the ones that telephoto out. So the ones that telephoto out, I want you to take note of those numbers and write down the ones that are on your lens, on your notebook that you said you were going to have in video 1. Because what happens is your aperture is going to change as you zoom. And I think that's something that people forget when they're working with these lenses that tend to have a fluctuating aperture. So if you have your lens set at the lowest number, which is 3.5, meaning that the most light is going to come in, and we're going to talk about that more in a second, and I zoom it, I'm going to go this way so you can see it, whoop, all right, then the aperture is going to change, which means it goes from here to get smaller, and your pictures are going to get darker. And you're going to go, wait a minute, I didn't touch any settings. Why are my pictures getting darker? It's because the lowest aperture you can have, the lowest number, changes depending on how zoomed in your lens is. So if you have a zoom lens or a telephoto lens and you have a range of numbers on there, make note, pay attention that it's going to change whether you change it or not when you zoom. Okay, moving on. Okay, so aperture, like I said, basically is a bunch of blades inside your lens that get bigger or smaller. So the f-stop or the f number is you telling the camera how much light to let in through the lens, okay? So sometimes it's a little complicated, right? You get the number, and it's a small number, but there's lots of light, and there's a big number and little light, and how do I remember that? Okay, so I am not a math person, I am an art person, okay? But even I got this. Think fractions. So if you replace the letter F with the number 1 and think 1 dash 2.8, that's like about a half, right? Meaning a half is a pretty big fraction in comparison to, say, like 1/22. Okay? So 1/22 of something is a very small fraction versus 1/2 of something. And that's exactly how they do the math. I'm not going to get into the equations, but basically it's the focal range and the size of the diameter and all these things. Just know that the smaller the number, the more light is being let in, and the bigger the number, the less light is being let in. Easy enough, right? But wait, there's more. So, aperture also controls depth of field, how much of your image is in focus. So that nice creamy, blurry background that everybody loves for portraits, that as soon as you master, all of your friends are going to say, wow, you're a professional, you should absolutely be charging money for your photos. I'm not saying that's not the case, but maybe learn a little bit more than just aperture before you start charging money. Okay, so nice blurry background, kind of like this, versus a very crisp image where you can see forever and ever and ever, kind of like that. So think of it this way. Small depth of field means less stuff is in focus. Larger depth of field means more is in focus in your image. And keep in mind, just as a side note, something to put in that notebook, that depth of field affects both in front of and behind your subject. So you might have something out of focus in front as well as behind. And that can be an artistic choice that looks really good, but when you aren't planning on having it there, sometimes, like, say you have a family shoot and the toddler runs at you, and all of a sudden the little kid is out of focus and the rest of the family is in focus. That's because depth of field affects both directions. And I think that's a point that some people forget. Speaking about family events and family shooting, a lot of people love taking pictures of families and kids and couples and weddings and all those things. That's awesome. But there's a big trend there right now of shooting wide open, meaning that they use the lowest aperture they have, maybe like a 1.4 or 1.8 because it's a fast lens and it's very on trend. And the reason that they say that they're doing this is because they want to have as blurry of a background as possible so it looks all dreamy and beautiful and it smooths out the skin. Now, all those things are true, but you also need to keep in mind that f like 1.4 and 1.8 is a really, really tiny depth of field. So when somebody moves slightly, you can get out of focus. And with a lot of beginner photographers, what I see is they'll post pictures on different Facebook groups and using my hashtag photos for the rest of us, and they complain that their images don't look crisp and they don't look completely in focus. And a lot of times it's because they're not completely in focus because the depth of field just wasn't big enough for their person's face, all right? So there are lots of ways to get a creamy background. Like I said, I will talk about aperture in another additional one. But just know that if you get your subject far enough away from the background, you can get that bokeh, that blurry, fuzzy, nice looking effect, even at a higher aperture, like maybe even 4.6 or 5.6, okay? So it's just a matter of understanding how the technology works. Don't just follow the trend. Understand the why behind everything. So real quick, let's go over everything. I think this is going to be the longest video in the series, so if you made it through, I'm super proud of you. Aperture. It's controlled in the lens of your camera. It is a blade that gets bigger and smaller that lets more and less light in, and that more or less light controls how much of your image is in focus. If you are down at 2.8, you're going to have less in focus in your image and a smaller depth of field. And if you are up in the higher numbers with your F numbers, like F9 and F11, you're going to have a much bigger depth of field. And that's typically used for things like landscapes, whereas the smaller depth of field is used more for portraits. Traditionally, right now, you make your own rules. So if you're still with me, go ahead and hit the like button. Let me know that you're still with me. Let me know that we're in this together. And if you have any questions, please comment below. Or if you're just having a great time and you think that my funny jokes are fantastic, please comment on that too, because my family doesn't think I'm funny at all. And then stick with me, because I didn't say it would be easy. I said it would be worth it. Okay, I didn't say that, but I would have said that if I'd thought about it in the first video. And we are moving on to video number 3.